Over the past 75 years, more than 10,000 chemicals have entered our food supply, but the EU allows just 300 additives. At Thrive Market, we prioritize quality, banning over 1,000 ingredients found in conventional grocery stores. Our Healthy Swap scanner helps you find better versions of your pantry essentials without the junk, dyes, or fillers, and everything is delivered right to your doorstep. So shop at a grocery store that actually cares about your health at thrivemarket.com/getstarted for 30% off your first order and a free $60 gift.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/audio.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com. You can just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our guest today is Dr. Danica Hubbard. She's written a book called Sex Offender, My Father's Secrets, My Secret Shame. She's also involved with a group called PrisonFamiliesAlliance.org, and she runs a couple of programs there called Coping with Loss and Support for Families of Sexual Offenders. She also works for the Illinois Criminal Justice. Dr. Hubbard, are you there?
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. Can you tell us about yourself? Who is Dr. Danica Hubbard?
Well, thank you for having me. I am an English professor of composition, and I've been teaching at a community college full-time for about 30 years, coming up on 30 years. So I've worked with several students and enjoy reading their narratives, their personal narratives, and their rhetorical analysis and research. And a couple of years ago, I decided to take a big sip from the cup of courage and write my own personal narrative, a hybrid of academic research and my experience when my father was charged and convicted and sentenced and eventually went to a state prison in Wisconsin. And through that research, I bumped into the advocacy organization, Prison Families Alliance. I had never heard of it before. And it wasn't around that I knew of when my father went to prison in the year 2000. And I wish it was, because they're a special group of folks who get together via Zoom from across the country, and they have a loved one who is either in that sentencing process or in jail or in prison, state or federal, and they're struggling. They're the families and friends on the outside, and we say in the group it's almost as if you're outcarcerated instead of incarcerated, because you have that collateral damage that you're carrying. Your loved one committed a crime, but you are either stigmatized or looked upon negatively, or you have that shame that you carry because your loved one is imprisoned. So I work with that group, and I also develop curriculum with the criminology faculty and administration. I work with the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice and Justice Studies programs to develop classes for students.
And you said your dad was convicted in 2010?
No, he was convicted in 2000. So he, in February of 2000, he pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree sexual assault of a child. And the trial court at that time imposed and stayed a 30-year sentence on the first count and withheld the sentence on the second count, and then imposed 2 30-year terms of probation. And it's quite a story, but several years later, my father absconded from his probation in Georgia. He was granted a state transfer from the state of Wisconsin to the state of Georgia and violated his terms of probation. He went to Costa Rica, and he was extradited, and his probation was revoked on the second count, and he was returned to the trial court for an imposition of the sentence.
Oh, so that's amazing. So he was given several suspended 30-year sentences and basically didn't have to serve any time.
Oh, no, he did.
Oh, okay.
He did serve time. He did serve time for 17 years before he died of acute myeloid leukemia in a prison hospice in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, but let me understand that. But that's after he violated his conditions, right?
Correct. So he went to jail for about a year, and then yes, he was on probation in Wisconsin. He was granted this transfer to Georgia, where his brother lived, and the terms of that, or some of the terms and conditions, were that he register as a sex offender in the state of Georgia. He lived under his brother's roof and was employed, got a job, and as you're most likely familiar with the sex offender registry and the rules and regulations, I think there were 2 to 3 pages of rules in that he couldn't live in a certain mile radius of a school. He couldn't have his own personal computer. He couldn't live near a shopping mall. Again, all for the protection, with good reason, of children in that vicinity, in that area.
So to get that kind of a deal, he was very fortunate. And to blow it is mind-blowing. Was he always like this kind of a reckless man his whole life?
Well, I'm an only child, so you're talking to his only daughter. Yeah. I think that my father was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think there was definitely a fantasy and reality element to his life. I think he absolutely took a number of risks, and now that I discovered in the process of my research and writing this book that he offended not only once, where he was convicted and charged and sentenced and served time, but several times over the course of my childhood. And I didn't have any idea that he was committing these sexual deviations, these sexual crimes. He was hurting people. And I had no idea. And that obviously in and of itself is reckless and exploitive and disgusting behavior. And I did not know that about my father until I was around 31 years old.
And how were you able to come to that conclusion in hindsight, like looking back and seeing the signs as an adult?
Well, he confessed. He
Okay.
He acquiesced, and he was literally down on his knees. And it was a weekend. We were living in Illinois, my husband and myself. I had a 1-year-old daughter at the time who was napping upstairs. And we were in the living room, and he fell to his knees and confessed that he had hurt a 6-year-old girl. And it was like an out-of-body experience as a daughter listening to your father talk about this heinous, absolutely just unbelievable crime that he committed. And when it happened, again, I just was in complete denial. I couldn't believe it because I had only known my dad as a provider financially, as a buoyant, charismatic leader in the community. He was our softball coach in high school. He was a religious leader in the Catholic Church. He was a very successful corporate executive, both domestically and internationally. He worked for an office supply company. And I had this idea of who my dad was. And obviously that was completely shattered when he told me that he was a convicted, or he could be at that point. He wasn't convicted yet, but he was a sex offender.
And you were 31 years old.
I was 31 years old and had a daughter of my own.
That was my next question. How old was your daughter?
1.
Okay.
She was a toddler.
What about nieces, though, and nephews?
Well, I married into a big family, so we had over 20 nieces and nephews.
Oh, my God.
And to my knowledge, on my husband's side, he did not violate any of those nieces or nephews, but through my research for the book, I did find out that he violated one of my family members who will remain anonymous. And I do write about her in my book because I interviewed her extensively. And to say I was dry heaving at the keyboard is an understatement. Her knowledge and her retention of all of the details regarding my father were absolutely horrific. I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. As a victim of sexual abuse myself, I have such empathy, such compassion, such radical compassion for victims of sex abuse. It's tragic. It can obviously change your whole trajectory of relationships and trust. And as an adult survivor of sexual abuse, when you live with those memories for such a long time, when you keep those secrets or when you carry that shame, it's very difficult to move on. That experience stays with you. That collateral damage, that shrapnel that you hold as a victim, stays with you throughout. And, you know, according to the RAIN group, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, one of the largest anti-sexual violence organizations in the country, statistically, every 9 minutes, a child is sexually assaulted in the United States. And 93% of those children know their perpetrator. So again, my father was violating my family, members of my family, and my friends. But I didn't know that until I started researching for the book.
Well, on this day when you were 31 years old, you must have been traumatized beyond belief. How did you handle that? What did you seek? Did you seek out help right away? How did you handle that?
Well, to say it was difficult to digest, again, the gravity of the situation is so large and beyond. Again, there were no signposts or indicators of his sex offending. And it was like a grieving process. And to back up a little bit, prior to my dad confessing his sex offense, one sex offense, by the way, he didn't confess to all. And there are, I'm sure, many I don't know of to this day and will never know of. But my mother had died of cancer, and that grieving process was similar in my experience to my father admitting that he was a sex offender. But clearly, I did not get the support that I did with my mother when she was diagnosed of physical ailments. I, through my research, have found out that sex offending is a legal term, but pedophilia is a clinical term. And a pedophile is someone sexually attracted to prepubescent children. And it's classified as a mental disorder. It's in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And I say now that my father died of a mental illness and my mother died of a physical illness. And trying to wrap my head around that mental illness was completely foreign and unfamiliar to me. So there was a grieving process. There still is, to be quite honest. 5 years post-mortem, my father died about 5 years ago. I still carry that grief. And it's a cycle of anger and denial and acceptance, and then cycling again, depending on the month or the day or the year of reflection or memory about my father and about our family. So I did seek out therapy. To be honest, at that time in the early 2000s, it was very difficult to find a therapist who could speak openly and from an expertise to a person who was not violated by her father, but who was an indirect victim of his actions. So it was a different type of therapy that I was seeking. You know, how do you cope as a daughter of a sex offender, but you're not the victim of that perpetrator, but you are indirectly. So that was very difficult through the years. So I basically became very insular and extremely private, and carried that shame and guilt for about 20 years through his whole incarceration. I didn't breathe a word to my friends in the neighborhood or anyone at work in my employment. Obviously, my husband knew, and some of his family members knew, but when my father died, I announced his death, and generally speaking, when someone dies, they support the living. So we held a funeral mass, and my friends came, and my husband's friends came who knew my father, and my coworkers came, and our daughter's friends came. Needless to say, the vestibule was full. And when the priest, my cousin, talked about my father in the homily, he said, well, as we all know, Jim Caldwell was a sex offender. And you could just audibly hear the gasps from everyone who was there to support us in our grief. Because I would say about 99% of the people at the funeral mass did not know my dad was incarcerated.
Oh, boy.
So that was another cycle of grief, because how do you explain that? It's not something that you bring up when you're walking your daughters to school. It's not something that you bring up at a Girl Scout meeting. It's not something that you bring up at a committee meeting at work. I carried a lot of shame. Brene Brown talks about shame theory, and I write about that in my book. And I think that indirect victims like myself, family of incarcerated people, carry that shame and guilt. Even though they didn't commit the crime, there is such a residual effect of the crime that their loved one committed.
Yeah, especially when as we were talking off the air before the show, like, people always assume, well, they had to know. They had to have known, right? Well, what kind of reaction did you get when this came out at the funeral from your friends and your family?
Well, there was shock and disbelief. Some of my friends hypothesized that, oh, that's why you were quiet, or I always thought there was some underlying thing that was going on, but you didn't say much. Because I think traditionally and typically, people will ask if your daughter's having a ballet recital, or if it's Father's Day, or if holidays are around the corner. I think a typical question is, are you going to get together with your family? Or are the grandparents going to come to the ballet recital?
Right.
And I was always dodging those traditional, typical questions. Oh, my father's busy, or he's out of town. And so it was this deception that I had to carry because I was embarrassed and humiliated with good reason. I mean, someone who is a sex offender is a pariah, is, as people I've presented to say, scum of the earth, deviants, terrible human beings. They don't deserve to breathe. That was my father. And it's a paradox, this relationship that of conflicting thoughts, of empathy and anger. But I realized that when you love someone, you can still have feelings of compassion and feelings for their punishment. It's just maneuvering.
Yeah, right. People don't tell each other, hey, my uncle's in prison, my father's in prison. When meanwhile, 25% of this country is either in prison, jail, probation, or some kind of court-supervised release, okay? And I tell my audience all the time, the guy doesn't show up for work on Monday morning, and he shows up on Tuesday, and you figure, well, he had a headache, and he hung over or something, he was sick. When meanwhile, the guy had a DUI or he got a domestic violence. And you don't tell everyone, but it's astronomical how many people in this country wind up in the jackpot over there. You're much more likely to be sitting at the defense table than you ever will be at the prosecution table. And you should keep that in mind. I'd like to back up a little bit here. The nature of the crime that got your father 3 30-year sentences, what was the crime? What did he do to who?
He sexually assaulted a 6-year-old girl. And I don't know all of the details of that sexual assault. I don't think I ever will know all of the details. But when he dropped to his knees, when I told you that we were in the living room, the only confessional that came out of his mouth at that time was, I only touched her on her underwear. Ugh. And I will never forget that phrase. I only touched her on her underwear. Even then, even in that confession, justifying that intimacy, justifying that violation. Again, as a victim of sexual abuse myself, I just find it impossible that phrase could even come out of his mouth. It's maddening. I mean, even at that time, I just wanted to just reach out and shake him. What are you saying? It's unbelievable. So,
yeah. Some people have a whole nother world going on in their head, and they don't say it out loud like it happened in your situation, but it's a lot more common than you think. Now, you were 31 years old when he confesses to you. I guess the initial reaction is, I'm disgusted, but he's your dad. You must have rallied around him and tried to mediate the penalties for this, right? And help him with his case and stuff. Did you do that?
Well, after he confessed, clearly the walk of going through that is so arduous and, again, unfamiliar to us, as I'm sure, hopefully, to many families. So you're trying to, again, grapple with healing a wound that he's caused, and feeling orphaned or lost or untethered, but then also trying to support him. So throughout the process with his attorneys, I would say that he had much more knowledge of his case than we did. So he wasn't sharing. Again, he was out of state. I was a full-time professor, full-time mom, a wife. We were living in a different state. And so he was dealing with it in Wisconsin, but still asking for assistance in terms of, can you be a character witness? Can you write a letter to the judge? Can you show up to the trial? Which I did, all of those things. And I tried to stand up for my father with the knowledge wrapping around that he perpetrated harm. And this evil and insidiousness is not acceptable. So again, it's this straddling of both worlds. He was my father, and he was lovable and unlovable. I mean, I just, it's very difficult to come to terms with, to look your father in the eyes at 31 years old and recount all the memories that you have of him, the good memories that you have of him, and then rewind and reflect and think, was he being his true self? I don't think so, because now I'm questioning everything. Why did he coach our softball team? Why did we invite a friend on vacation? Was it because I was an only child and needed another companion my age, a peer? Or was it because he was grooming or planning on sexually violating those friends?
Remind the audience, we're talking to Dr. Danica Hubbard, and the book is called Sex Offender, My Father's Secrets, My Secret Shame. Incredible stuff here, Professor. When did you become involved with the Prison Families Alliance?
During the course of the research for my book.
Okay.
So when I first started writing the manuscript, I just found it impossible, as my awareness was heightened even more, to read a newspaper or watch television or see a movie without being confronted with reports of sexual abuse in so many iterations and forms. I mean, the topic is a constant in our lives. It's a perennial problem in churches, in scouting, in schools, on sports teams, in politics. I just struggled to find ways to help heal those hurts caused by sexual abuse. And I, in the research, reached out to Julia LAZARECK, who wrote a book, actually a little manual, about going to prison for the first time if you have an incarcerated family or friend. And, of course, her book was not available when my father went to prison, and I sure wish I had had it, because I had never been inside of a jail or prison in my life. And to say it's jarring, again, is an understatement. So when you visit a prison, there are all sorts of sensory images and sights and sounds and smells and rules and regulations that are applied to family or friends who go and visit that incarcerated person. And I just remember the first time I was so naive and just completely unaware. I brought cookies to the prison. Cookies. Yeah. Just thinking, well, everyone can have a chocolate chip cookie. I mean, this is great. I mean, really? It's ridiculous. I don't know what I was thinking. Again, it was my father that was incarcerated, and most people may say, lock him up and throw away the key. I don't care if he doesn't deserve a treat or a cookie. That's terrible. Again, I'm not in denial of the actions that he did, that he was convicted of, but he was still my father. For 31 years, I knew him a certain way. So to go into a prison and to visit your loved one is such an upside down feeling, and to wait in line and to fill out the paperwork and to go through the metal detector and to go through the barbed wire fences and to hear the metal doors open and close. It's a horrible place. And again, is that where a sex offender belongs? Yes. In my opinion, yes. But they're still human. They're still human beings. And I don't want to humanize a sexual offender, but how do you detach yourself from that?
As soon as you mentioned prison, I wrote down the word inhumane, because the way we treat prisoners is just the whole thing in there is just inhumane. Now, when he got sentenced to these 3 30-year suspended sentences, were you shocked that he was able to walk out of there?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so you said you didn't curse,
Absolutely
right?
shocked. I mean, because I wasn't privy to all of the conversations with his attorney. I certainly wasn't sitting in on those meetings or emails or correspondences with my father. Clearly, my father was manipulative. Clearly, my father could put lipstick on a pig. Clearly, he had the skill set to maneuver and convince people, right? That's part of the grooming process in and of itself, is to exercise an authoritative mindset, is to convince people how great you are. And he was working with his attorney, and actually by the whole end of his before he died, a series of attorneys. And just reading through some of the paperwork was shocking. the Court of Appeals and the decisions and the date he filed them. And I wasn't aware of any of those appeals that he was filing. And I just thought, oh my gosh, really, you're still fighting this thing? I mean, it's a suspension of reality. And I believe that's part of this mental illness. It's part of this disorder of minimizing or justifying these heinous acts of sex offending.
I bet you were shocked that he just walked out, because the average person thinks that they're getting life sentences and stuff like that. The average sentence is they serve 3.5 years on an 8-year sentence. Average child rape case. And if it's a family member, it's even less. And people have no idea. They should get the death penalty. They have no idea what's really going on. The one crime everybody can agree on, hey, this is the one most disgusting crime. You'd think there would be some penalties for it, but there really aren't.
Right. And I mean, again, I want to emphasize, I'm a child of the 1970s. We were taught stranger danger, this type of moral panic, where, anyone you didn't know was potentially a threat. So when I was growing up, a sex offender was profiled. The optic in our minds was a man in a white van luring children in the playground with candy. This was the stereotypical boogeyman hiding in the bushes or skulking in the shadows. That's not necessarily what a sex offender is. So I really urge parents and guardians and grandparents to have those open conversations. This is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. It's the point of view from a daughter of a sex offender. I wasn't a victim of his sex offending, but I was the daughter of a sex offender, living with a sex offender. No idea. So to have those conversations, if someone is offering to pick up your child, I mean, the sex offender registry, as you know, is available online. You can look up who is a registered sex offender in your neighborhood, and you can talk about it with your children to heighten the awareness, not to heighten the fear, but to be careful, to be cautious. It's tragic to take away that innocence. It's so, to carry that, again, that shrapnel for so long because of that sex offense is tragic.
Yeah, and they have pictures and addresses on that registry, so you might even recognize someone from your neighborhood who's hanging around the park or something. You can keep an eye on that kind of stuff yourself. But you said you wrote the book, and the question I wrote down was book bullseye. When you write this book, you're putting a bullseye in yourself. Your students know now, your coworkers know. A lot of people who didn't know before now know. What motivated you to do that? What made you take it so serious? It's easier to hide.
Well, I didn't have to ever talk about it again, especially when he died.
Yeah.
I never had to talk about it again because I felt safe after that.
Yeah.
He can't hurt anyone any longer. He's dead. Because even when he was incarcerated, I thought, oh my goodness, what if he's released? I have 2 daughters. What if he continues to offend when he's released? Even to the point of what if he is granted compassionate release, which made me feel horrible. Mm-hmm. Here he's dying of acute myeloid leukemia, and I have a whole chapter on health as a geriatric sex offender going in at the age of 60, all the health problems and issues that he suffered while in prison. But I was still afraid. I still carried that fear. And it can be very isolating and very dark. And I didn't want other indirect victims. I didn't want other daughters or wives or girlfriends or companions of people who are convicted sex offenders to feel like they committed the crime. They didn't. And I finally found my voice without shaking to talk about that, to talk about know the prisms, know the layers, know the tiers. I identify or try to what a sex offender is, and be aware of that. But also, if you know a convicted sex offender and you're continuing a relationship with that person, you're making a choice, what that means in your life. And I wrote it for, trying to resolve, trying to search for wholeness, heal a wound, or redeem some part of myself that had been lost, and to try to give a voice to what had been silenced.
Once again, we're talking to Dr. Danica Hubbard. The book is Sex Offender, My Father's Secrets, My Secret Shame. Go to prisonfamiliesalliance.org. There's a couple of programs there, coping with loss and support for families of sexual offenders, if you fit into this category. In your studies, did you find that there are family members and friends and spouses that look the other way?
Yes, because I think it is more common than not to have potentially a pedophile, and I make the distinction in terms, right? A sex offender, as you know, is a legal term. You can't be a convicted pedophile, but can be a convicted sex offender. So I just wanted to clear up the differentiation as an English professor in those terms. The guidelines to ensure consistent and appropriate use of those terminologies. They're not synonymous. So a pedophile is somebody who's sexually attracted to prepubescence, right? It's a mental disorder. So to be a pedophile, it doesn't mean that you're a convicted sex offender. And you could have a pedophile in your family, in your scouting troop, in your church, in your organization that is known, but it's like the elephant in the room. No one talks about it. It's an uncle or a brother and again, through my interviews, and I write about this extensively in the book, the pedophile that groomed me was in our neighborhood. And I was about 6 years old when it happened. And that pedophile was the magnet for our community, our neighborhood. He was Mr. Fun Guy, he and his family, and he had children, and everyone gravitated toward his house. And he would invite us in, and he had cartoons running all day long. And he had treats and soda and things that would be very attractive for small children who might have rules or restrictions at home. No, you can't have soda. No, you can't have cookies before dinner, things like that. But he provided all of those things. And my interaction as a 6-year-old with him was I knocked on the door in the neighborhood like I often did and wanted to play with his children. He was half a block away. And he answered the door and said they weren't home yet. And I had been in that house so many times before. I thought nothing of it, walking in with an adult, with a trusted authority figure, waiting for his children to come home. And, of course, the cartoons were running and the treats were available, so I was a happy 6-year-old. He went upstairs, and I don't know how much time later, but he called down from the upstairs bathroom, can you come up here, Danica? Can you come up here? And as a 6-year-old, I thought, well, I'm in the middle of my cartoon, so I really don't want to tear myself away. And what do you mean, can I come upstairs? I don't understand that. But again, he was an authority figure and an adult, and I was a rule follower, so I went upstairs. And he kept calling my name. I walked into the bathroom. He was completely naked. And again, as a 6-year-old, what a scene to see genitals and this adult that you know and is trusted. And I thought, oh my, and he said, no, wait. If you touch me, you can have another treat. You can have another Coke. You can have another soda. And I just ran. I just ran. That was my instinct. That was my fight or flight. And I didn't tell my parents. I didn't run home and tell my parents. because I didn't know what to do. I was confused. I was baffled. I was repulsed. I was ashamed. Should I have done what he told me to do? What do I do? And I think that happens a lot. And that was someone grooming me. That wasn't someone on top of me, violating me. I mean, that's a completely different level of sexual abuse and pedophilia.
Yeah, it's all so crazy and upside down, because a little kid in the neighborhood should be able to knock on our neighbor's door, a trusted neighbor, you've been there before, and not be a target of this kind of... It's just, everything's just so upside down, and things have just changed so much, too, and I'm 60 years old myself. It's changed so much. What has the public's reaction been to your book when you've come public?
Well, I went through a lot of marketing research with my publisher and did a lot of studies of, what optic to put out there. We went months and months and months about the graphic design on the cover of the book, and I was so careful and conscientious about pulling that theme throughout the book. So the cover of the book, and you could see it on Amazon, is a boat in very turbulent water, and there is a man in a prison jumpsuit, and he is shielding his face. And then there is a younger woman or girl in the back of the boat, and that is a portrayal of my father going forward, shielding himself, and me in the back of the boat reaching my hand out for help or assistance. And I think that picture, that visualization, that cover is a representation of we're in the same boat. I don't want to be in this boat with you. I'm not even facing you. I'm facing the back. I'm trying to plan my escape from you, but I'm still there. And he's moving forward to this turbulent water. So every chapter of the book has this nautical theme about moving through rough waters and trying to tread water and trying to survive, basically. So with that, when I put it out into the world, which was January of last year, January of 2021, oh my goodness, it was difficult. It was, I held my breath. I didn't know what to expect. I was very nervous and trepidatious and waiting for I don't know what, but it was so well received because shortly after I put it out, I am in the academic community, and I started having invitations to criminology classes and sociology classes. I spoke to a victimization class, and some of my presentations are supposed to be about an hour. An hour would turn into 3 hours. Mm-hmm. Students who were studying to be social workers, nurses, DCFS staff, future attorneys, future corrections officers, had poignant questions about the perpetrator because I was giving them a different view of a daughter of a sex offender and what that may look like. It was different than anything that they'd studied in their victimization class. So that was an avalanche of curiosity and questioning and analysis, and I am very comfortable in that environment. So I spoke with University of Illinois Chicago and North Central College and Eastern Illinois University and on and on. I spoke to the Prevent Child Abuse America organization, which, by the way, the proceeds of my book are donated to that nonprofit 501c3 organization to assist and to heighten awareness of child abuse in this country. So it was warmly received. I did quite a few book signings. There's a bookstore called Anderson's Bookstore in Naperville, Illinois, where I did a book signing that was packed. I've done book signings in Michigan at local stores and larger stores. So in that marketing and publicity blitz, it's been a very well-received book. I've done podcasts and magazine articles, etc. However, recently I did a YouTube channel interview in Los Angeles, California, and that had a much wider reach, as I'm sure that your radio program does. And there were different viewpoints, which I am receptive to, that I'm open to. Victims came forward, not of my father's, but victims of sexual abuse, and it can be so triggering. I mean, obviously, this is a lightning rod subject, and that agitation or numbness or disassociation of putting a sex offender in a certain category and just shoving it away is obviously a reaction that is warranted. I am in full support of victims of sexual abuse, again, being a victim myself. But there's also a lot of confusion and spewing hate and things of that nature that were very uncomfortable because of the book, because, again, it was a much, much larger audience. And I just go back to sharing information. This is a hybrid of my personal narrative and academic research. I'm fully aware that it is a sensitive and taboo subject. I realize that it can cause distress. Certainly it did for me. But I hope there is some form of gratitude in telling my story, that it sheds light on anyone who has suffered harm or perpetrated harm and is in need of support and healing.
Since you've been exposed to all this new information since releasing the book, any plans on a follow-up book?
I'd like to do a follow-up book. So many people have asked that. I've actually been asked also to do an audio recording of the book, because the book is available in paper form on Amazon. It's also available in electronic form on a Kindle to download. But I'm thinking quite strongly about doing an audio version of the book as well. I'd like to do a follow-up book because there has been so many questions about this subject, and it has opened the dialogue, and that was really the purpose, and most of the intention of the book was to spread that awareness.
So once again, we've been talking to Dr. Danica Hubbard. The book is Sex Offender, My Father's Secrets, My Secret Shame. Now, with this PrisonFamiliesAlliance.org and these programs, Coping with Loss and Support for Families of Sexual Offenders, what type of people would you like to invite to participate?
Well, it's open. It's an open Zoom call, and it's on the website, the PFA.org website. And anyone can join. We, knock on wood, have not had issues. But we have had social workers, we have had attorneys, mostly families. Quite recently, I found that there's been a spike in mothers who come to these peer group support sessions. And they are mothers of young men, their sons, who are either convicted sex offenders or who are waiting for sentencing or are in that process. And it's tied to online behavior.
Yep.
It's tied to misuse of technology. And I don't know the granular details of that. I'm certainly not an expert in the online component of that. But it is, again, another level of sex offending. And these young men, with good reason, are being tried and convicted. I often share a story in my presentations about a Netflix documentary or docuseries called Cheer. And there is a young man in the docuseries about a cheerleading team, a community college cheerleading team in Texas. His name is Jerry Harris. And he was charged with the production of child pornography. And he pled guilty on these federal charges related to soliciting child sex abuse imagery and illegal sexual conduct with minors. He was a beloved character on this Netflix docuseries, primarily for his boisterous personality and his heartwarming backstory. In fact, he lived in Naperville, Illinois, and he has been convicted now, but at the time he faced up to 50 years in federal prison after he pleaded guilty to coercing teenage boys to send him obscene photos and videos on his phone. And at that time, Jerry Harris was 22 years old.
And with the addiction we have to these phones now, that's it's only going to get worse. But your last thought, we only have a couple of minutes left.
My last thought is I hope that people purchase the book with an open mind. It's available on Amazon, as I said earlier, Sex Offender, My Father's Secrets, My Secret Shame. And I hope that it can continue the conversation, explore behavior, heighten awareness, and again, promote healing.
Dr. Danica Hubbard, thank you so much. Once again, prisonfamiliesalliance.org. Anything you ever want, if you ever want to come back and just read recipes to me, I'll just have you back. I really, really enjoyed this, and if people appreciate these presentations she's given us today, Sex Offender, My Father's Secrets, My Secret Shame, and check out the prisonfamiliesalliance.org. Thank you so much, Dr. Danica Hubbard.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.